You may have noticed, of course, that France has the presidency of the Council of the European Union until the 30th of June. So we need to make the most of this opportunity. And we're talking about cross-border cooperation with a world population that could reach 10 billion in 2050. Environmental resources in terms of water, energy, raw materials are becoming exhausted. So how do we maintain several ODDs, such as the fight against poverty or against hunger, in an aging Europe, which is the case? How can we better share our resources beyond borders? I'm going to talk about this with three guests today. Mauro Lucianaz, president of the committee of the valdôtaines Grand-Paradis. Buongiorno.
La protection des ressources des sols et des espaces à la frontière italo-française.
You represent the protection of spaces and soils on the Franco-Italian border. Thomas Zeller, hello, president of the Trinational Eurodistrict of Basel, and Hiba Debouk, deputy director of the territories at Interdisciplinary Architecture Practice. So continue to send us your excellent questions and online, and of course we will take questions from the audience towards the end of our discussion, so please prepare those questions. So Mr. Luciana, on what is at stake in your territory in terms of the exodus, of course, which touches this particular territory, how to make more attractive these somewhat inaccessible areas. Hello, everyone. Well, La Concom Grand-Paradis is in the Val d'Aoste, in the smallest of the Italian regions at the border with France and Switzerland. And so we have 13 communes, approximately 15,000 inhabitants. So it's a small canton, should we say, with a rural territory in a mountainous landscape. And there are communes belonging to the National Park of the Grand-Paradis that were constituted in order to protect fauna and flora. And this enabled an economic development of our territory from a touristic point of view and an agricultural point of view. But of course, there are several factors that have an impact on the economies of our territories. The reduction in terms of our population, the numbers in our population, and climate change. In terms of our population, a low birth rate, which is generalized, and the high cost of living in mountain areas, heating costs, transport costs are issues, and then generally living conditions in mountainous rural areas. The fact that populations there are isolated and they have more difficult access to services. And then, of course, I was mentioning the climate change with the increase in temperatures and the reduction in rainfall and glaciers melting. This will bring problems to agriculture and to tourism, or both. When you mention climate change, indeed, this is something that we have already begun to talk about here. Yes, well, climate change with the water crisis and the problems this represents for our population and agriculture. It's something that normal citizens are actually beginning to perceive. Up to now, it was something a little distant that didn't seem to affect the population generally, but now things are changing. And in order to face all these issues, we will need to develop resilient territories that can slow down the low birth rate and the emigration from our region, and to welcome indeed new residents, because following the pandemic and due to the increase in temperatures, people are looking for territories like ours. But that in itself, of course, can lead to problems. So are you talking about urban residents that are looking for sort of greener territories such as ours, more rural? Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that we witnessed during the first lockdowns in 2020. Some cities were closed down. And from a touristic point of view, people went in search of the mountains, but they weren't really ready for that lifestyle. And we also need to work on a change, a culture of change. We need to prepare people to a new future. And to work on all these issues, to develop a resilient territory, well, we've worked with other partners. We forgot our geographical boundaries, we forgot our borders. And with the partners, we constituted an association of cross-border cooperation. And this association is only a month old. It's called Terre Action. I'm the vice chairman of the Terre Action Association. There is also Jean-François Duc, the president, who belongs to the Savoie community, and then the Versandem community, our partner, and two Italian partners too are associated with this. And the goal of this association is to work together because cross-border cooperation has much added value. And also it enables us to learn about new cultures. It also enables us to look at problems from different points of view and to be able to find concrete answers together in terms of the needs of our territories. So the Terre Action Association that we established wishes to provide answers, and we wish to work together in these areas. And we wish to be able to create together an EGTC, a European Grouping of Territorial Cooperation. So we wish to work together on a solid basis, because in order to cooperate, we need to build trust, first of all. And that trust indeed has to be built on a daily basis with our partners. We've been working for several years together. And of course, we don't wish partners to change, when elected representatives change over the years. So that's why it takes time to build trust in each other. And so we established this association in order to forget, as I was saying, borders and to be able to carry on working together. Well, this is a very good example for the Borders Forum, a very good example of a very new project. It's a newborn, which we welcome at this Borders Forum. We are also with Thomas Zeller, who's the president of the Trinational Eurodistrict of Basel, and you're involved in several projects, in particular the Drylands project, which is very emblematic in order to transform sustainably the urban environment. Of course, your environment is much more urban than the one we've just been talking about. No, hello, everyone. Yes, absolutely. We have very different problems in our territory. If you take the border between France, Switzerland, and Germany, well, this is exactly where we are in this Euro district. And for the last 10 years or so, since 2010, we've been working with the Euro district, with Uniba, the International Bauhausausstellung in Basel. So during 10 years, thanks to this project, we've been able to develop several themes, and there will be many more in the future. And amongst these projects, we have the Dryland project, which is a first in France, certainly. We're talking about a port sector on the three sides of the border. So we're talking about dryland. That's the exact pronunciation, dryland, three lands. Yes, we call it the dryland project, well known in Switzerland and Germany for the dryland Eck, the dryland corner. And speaking of resource management, one of the problems we have is managing real estate. In a territory as dynamic as ours, real estate management is very significant, and even more so for the future with the new regulations, in particular with zero net. So how can we guarantee development and economic development in our territories? The developments also of housing for our inhabitants. We have one of the strongest birth rates, and we have one of the more attractive economic areas. And the dryland project is one of these projects. Since 2010, studies have been carried out, and until 2050, we hope to be able to welcome 20,000 people as new residents and for work in an area, an island that we're going to create in the port areas. So the transformation of a port area in a working area and residential area, with all the difficulties, of course, this means, the materials that are needed, sustainable development, maintain also the natural aspects of the Rhine area, difficulties in terms of water supply. Thank you. Madame Hiba Debouk, you are going to tell us about projects piloted by the AREP, Interdisciplinary Architecture Practice, Luxembourg in transition. We're talking about developing our common resources and the land or soil resource in particular as a raw material for ecological transition. This is something that you're working on. You have the floor, Madame Debouk. Well, thank you very much. Yes, indeed, I'm going to talk about Luxembourg in transition. And it's a mission that we've just launched for the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg with AREP, our partner, with the objective being to put in a development projects of the territory, which will enable us to achieve decarbonization and greater resilience by 2050 for the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg and its functional area. And we're talking here about an administrative area, which is defined by two criteria, directly linked to the mobility of workers, so mobility linked to employment. And so we're talking about a territory that is 4 times larger than Luxembourg, 2 million inhabitants, 200,000 workers that cross the border regularly to go to work in Luxembourg mainly, and approximately 800 communes, 100 Luxembourg ones, and 700 that are Belgian, French, and German. So how do we take into account the cross-border dimension? Well, that is because there is a strong connection between these different territories in terms of employment and therefore of mobility, but also land development in general, health, habitats, commerce, economic development. But also, it's also an ecological transition project, and we know, of course, how important these aspects are. But if we all think in silos, of course, it's very difficult, more difficult to take into account this sustainable development aspect. So, by way of example, in terms of the project of decarbonization of Luxembourg, we've worked on mobility, the transition of real estate, and the agricultural patrimony. In terms of mobility, it is clear that we need to cross the borders of Luxembourg to treat decarbonization, because after all, we are in a territory which has a significant carbon footprint. Luxembourg, apart from the functional area, Luxembourg has 23 tons of CO2 equivalents per habitant per year, so it's the highest in Europe. In the functional area, somewhat less, and that's because of the fact that there are long distances, commuting distances to go to work. So this, of course, means a high carbon footprint. And also, we have a lifestyle that consumes many resources and energy, and a lifestyle that reflects this. And of course, uncontrolled urbanization also is another factor. And of course, we have residential areas, trade areas, industrial areas. And on the issue of mobility, in order to decarbonize mobility, we need to deal with the issue at border and cross-border level. For example, what we call programmatic orientation. We need to be able to work on projects that enable us to favor local factors. We've also worked on major infrastructures, and we've worked on the tax regime too, because in Luxembourg, you need to know that there are tax deductions that are proportional to the lengthening of the commuting distance to work. So we have tax legislations that generate mobility on our borders, and that encourages more mobility and therefore more carbon, a greater carbon footprint. Well, Luxembourg has 600,000 inhabitants, so it's a small duchy, but nevertheless, 200,000 workers cross the borders every day, and many French workers in particular, but also Belgian workers and German workers. So in fact, you're on everybody's border, shall we say. You are a state, you're a border state, we could say, absolutely. So 600,000 inhabitants in Luxembourg, but 2 million altogether for Luxembourg and its area functional, amongst which the 200,000 cross-border workers. Yes. And Monsieur Lucianaz, there are already questions that would like to come and live in your territory, in Italy, in your mountains. So have cross-border mountains, has it become a new haven for those urban dwellers suffering from climate change? Well, you've already answered this in some particular area, saying that urban dwellers are not fully suited to mountain life. Yes, well, one can well imagine that people, in order to fight against climate change, wish to find a haven perhaps in mountainous regions, but it might not be a total answer. As I was saying earlier, the problem is with the melting of the glaciers and the water supply problems for our residents. And so this might act as a break for urban dwellers wishing to come to mountains to find a haven against climate change. Thank you. And also, Monsieur Zeller, there's a question for you. It's quite interesting. Sustainable building, has it the same definition in France and Germany, two member countries of the EU, and Switzerland? And how can you come to a common understanding as a cross-border area? Well, it's a very large question. Indeed, three countries, three visions of the urban landscape and development, which is very different. Over the last few years, of course, we've tried to harmonize this and work towards the same projects. Germany had a considerable head start these last 20 years, with many more ecological neighborhoods than in France or even in Switzerland. So we tended to follow the German model on our side. But I have to say that we're catching up, and we have different visions of land development. In Switzerland is heavily built and very dense up to the border. This factor is sort of average in Germany. And in France, we've looked at many ecological areas. And these three different visions need to work together. And this is what we do at Eurodistrict. After 10 years of projects on urban planning, cross-border urban planning, that enables us to go beyond borders and this concept of urbanism. And so we have many years ahead of us in order for us to be able to truly converge in terms of the new needs for building and ecological neighborhoods. But I'm very optimistic, I must say. Thank you. Madame Debouk, Luxembourg, you're talking about a very rich country, but not very green, because you're saying it's the carbon footprint is still very high, the highest in Europe, you were saying. There are many urban spaces, but of course, it's a very small country. So, of course, there's lots of building going on. So it's very dense from that point of view. But can we say that with the war in the Ukraine and the new needs to produce, to build incessantly? Aren't we talking about contradictory needs, aspirations for Europe? And do you feel that you are truly supported, since you are trying to work on more sustainable projects? And as you mentioned yourself, an ecological transition economy. Well, when you say it's not a very green country, Luxembourg, but you said that we were interested in soil as a raw material for transition. Yes, and it is. Our projects are based on this in terms of the ecological transition project. And we discovered that the territory, in fact, was a lot greener than you might think. There are more than 50% of agricultural areas, over a third of forests, and less than 10% of urbanized areas. But then we've calculated that the scale of Luxembourg in our functional areas beyond our borders is an interesting scale in this respect, but also in terms of ecological transition, on carbon neutrality, on food safety, and as an example, I would say that for Luxembourg and its functional areas, we've calculated that the square meters were crossed with the increase in the population by 2050, the rate of vacancy and of occupation, and we discovered that the existing real estate was sufficient to be able to accommodate all the population by 2050. It is a symbolic calculation because not all the population might not wish to necessarily live in those areas, but certainly for Luxembourg, we're talking about zero gross. And on the agricultural issue, since we talked about the war in Ukraine, of course, food safety is an issue. In terms of Luxembourg and its functional areas, we have calculated that by 2050, and you should know that the model, of course, we're talking about an intensive chemical agricultural landscape today. Yes, you perhaps don't have the room to be self-sufficient, like as in a large country like France. Yes, that's true. But with our 52% of agricultural land, we could be self-sufficient. If we could change our lifestyle by 2050, that means we consume less meat, for example, dividing that consumption of meat by 2 by 2050. Well, we've discovered that by 2050 we could be self-sufficient. But of course, we need to move our agricultural model to a more sustainable one, and we have the means to show more solidarity with our neighboring regions, and in terms of forests as well, because the forests are able, of course, to capture the CO2, which is very important for carbon neutrality. So it's a small country that doesn't seem that green, but it is greener than you think. It's a very rich country, and can indeed deal with these issues of ecological transition. Now, in terms of your territory, your mountainous region, there are subsidies, of course, accorded to mountainous areas by the EU. And here we're talking about the European Green Deal, and also 750 million euros that is earmarked mostly for this transition. Do you receive most of this money, or do you feel that you're sufficiently supported? Well, there are European strategies as well as national strategies. And from an economic point of view, I would say that we are quite well supported, yes. We need to be able to seize this opportunity, of course. And this is what we do by working with our partners. And it is possible to find common solutions to capitalize the projects of others and to bring answers to our territories in this way. And this is why we established this association that I mentioned earlier, in order to face the needs of our territories and exploit the possibilities coming from Europe and its strategies combined with our national strategies. Thank you. And please prepare your questions and continue to send them on CEDO. We have an interesting question here from Mr. Zeller, perhaps. In order to go beyond any problems between countries, should we not try to overcome legal barriers by creating a transnational legal framework? Now, I would say, as a European expert, that we already have an international legal framework, and that is the EU. We're talking about a single market, and so we do have a legal framework for the whole of the EU. But perhaps we're talking about going a little bit further in terms of cross-border areas and what needs to be created. Should we create a specific legal framework, international legal framework? Yes, you're right. There is a supranational legal framework, as you say, the EU, but we forget perhaps the borders. And we heard this with what was said previously. We tend to reason a little too much more nationally. And I think that we don't really need a new legal framework that would represent a new burden in terms of regulations. I think we should be, on the contrary, more flexible. We should be more flexible in cross-border areas that don't have the same needs as other regions, be it in France, Germany, or Italy. And we have a specific, the specific nature of Switzerland as well on top, which belongs to the Schengen area, of course, but everything to do with land development and other matters, that's not included. So Switzerland, of course, will sign agreements when it's interesting for their own territories. So the three countries, I think a more flexible framework should be created for them. That is not too vague, of course, but sufficiently flexible. That means that local authorities can carry out projects without having to take into account the heavy burdens of three countries. It's very difficult to follow the regulations of a single country, let alone three. And many projects can be very difficult to carry out, of course, with all the hoops that you have to go through in terms of regulations. So you're talking about simplifying administration procedures, of course. So we'll take a question perhaps from the public. We have two questions here. Go ahead.
Yes, hello. I was a European deputy for a long time, and I would like to ask Madame Debouk, you are speaking about fiscality. You took part in a parliamentary mission, and in what you have just said, can we solve the problem of disparity between either side of a border? For example, urban development, development of services in Luxembourg, as well as in your various territories, which mean that we install services infrastructure on one side of a border or the other because the taxation is more favorable, urbanization is more favorable. How do you approach this problem? Thank you for the question. As I said earlier, one of the major problems of the cross-border region is this challenge. So in terms of fiscality, Luxembourg fiscality encourages people to install themselves on other sides of the borders to come and work in Luxembourg, which poses a mono installation of these areas. And we wanted to know how to include French Belgian colleagues in discussions on fiscality on the environmental transition. And this was driven by
donc le ministère de
l'Aménagement du Territoire et de l'Énergie, different groups in Luxembourg, the Scientific Council,
et deux autres comités particulièrement intéressants sur la
and
question.
it was particularly interesting to consider the links across the borders. There was a consultative committee and a citizenship committee. In the consultative committee, we had French, Belgian, German colleagues where we were able to discuss fiscal questions, space organization, job organization, and in the citizenship committee, which took part not just in the debates, but also produced a report like us and delivered it to the ministry to propose challenges in terms of carbon reduction. And this was made up of 30 citizens, including 25 from Luxembourg and 5 from Germany, Belgium, France, who represent the diversity of civil society which we find in the functional area. I think the way that we organize this with the support of these two committees enabled us to have more links locally with neighbouring countries on all proposals, which were then delivered to the ministry to consider decarbonisation by 2050. So this is how we can create links between the territories. There was a question from a gentleman further back. Sir, have you got the microphone? Can you reach the microphone? Over to you. Yes, hello. Thank you very much to the speakers. I'm a researcher at Lausanne University. Mr. Zeller, you spoke about more flexibility for local regional players. So more flexibility means delegating powers and skills by national bodies. So a question which is quite concrete, how will you convince these actors, because it is always a delicate question, they seek to gain more powers, but it's difficult to release them. So what strategy do you have in the Eurodistrict in Basel? What do you think you will put in place to counter national players to give more powers to local players? Thank you. Quite simply through relations which we say that we have with our elected representatives, our local parliamentary representatives for Alsace, because we have Euro districts along the Rhine, and this question, this challenge is identical across different Euro districts and indeed elsewhere across the border region. So we are working with parliamentarians who are very involved in their constituency. So when we talk about the challenges of these three countries and we have administrative problems, that is where we need to explain that things need to change, explain what our vision is across the three countries and escalate information to enable them to act, to simplify proceedings in future. For example, during the pandemic, when the borders closed, the previous speaker spoke about this. This was a shock for all the elected representatives across the border. I have two borders with France, and I am a mayor of a small commune as well in Alsace. So I have a vision of the different strata, the different layers. But when the borders were closed, when you have one mayor who writes to the prefect, that doesn't get followed up. But when you have a three-national Euro district presided by a German mayor at the time, because we have a rotating presidency of this Euro district, you represent 82 communes and you represent 900,000 inhabitants in the same area. So sharing this information with the weight of a territory means we are much more heard, much more listened to, and that's enabled us to avoid another closure of the borders a few weeks later. So it's lobbying, quite simply. It's lobbying from bottom to top. Your neighbour is very interested in this. I see that he's nodding and that he now wants to sign letters on behalf of several people because that works better. Does that inspire you? I think, Mr. Lucianaz. Yes, it's very interesting, but I was thinking above all of the number of inhabitants. I am mayor of a small commune, 900 inhabitants, and I was counting the inhabitants in our region compared to yours. We are a lot smaller in reality, just 50,000 inhabitants, and we are not yet focusing on questions such as those you have had to face, but the aim, the goals are the same, to co-create from bottom to top. We haven't yet thought about lobbying, but co-creation, yes. So I want to ask you a question because we started to raise this with you, Mrs. Debouk, but Mr. Zeller, this war in Ukraine led us to realize that we need to feed Europe's population. So a green pact with restrictions on fertilizers, brakes on organization. Is this a good thing in terms of strategic development? So we should put environmental matters to one side, perhaps. Is that what you feel in terms of the sustainable projects across borders? Are they threatened, in fact, now because there are other priorities? There's a war and a pandemic. Our cross-border projects, no, I don't think they are threatened at all. I almost want to say quite the opposite. We realize today that this cross-border cooperation, this need to live beyond borders is increasingly important. We no longer wish to impose closures on us. Indeed, the existence of borders. When you live in a border area, I can reassure you that for a young elected representative like me, I would never have thought that borders could be closed again just 2 years ago. And from one day to the next, you realize that you can no longer cross somewhere you were used to crossing in just a few minutes on a bicycle across France, Germany and Switzerland. It's something we want to continue to live. We want to continue to have this trinational space. So no, I think the international situation, quite the opposite. We need trans-border projects. So really, we need to focus. So focusing on sustainable development. So protection of nature, protection of natural spaces, which already exist in our area. We are a very dense sector already, which is very built up. We will no longer be able to unbuild our decarbonize our district, yes, but making greener through decarbonization, yes. Lots of trinational projects are focused on this. So for example, the tram from France to Switzerland, the Dryland project that you spoke about once again, with a bridge with an environmental tram on the bridge, with a tram on our side of the bridge, with cycle tracks. Yes, we're encouraged to do all of this and to consider our rural spaces, to protect our rural spaces, to develop them, to feed our sector. So decarbonisation exists for you, or is sufficiently encouraged, or are we still questioning what is the most opportune for Europeans, for inhabitants across borders? I think that the goals today are shared by everybody. If I talk about the discussions of this with civil society in the Luxembourg project, we were very pleasantly surprised to hear a commitment on environmental matters. They are ready to change practices, behaviours, ways of life to prepare this transition to adapt to climate change, reduce carbon emissions and preserve the opportunities for carbon storage in their region. Today are, in terms of the goals, they are often poorly quantified. We have goals for transition, construction, forestry, and so on, but we find it difficult to understand which actions can be compatible with a real ambition for transition. And that is why Luxembourg is now working on metrics tool which can record the reductions in carbon footprint. When I talk about the three challenges, mobility, transition, and of the environment and the area, those parties who took part in this study, the quantities of carbon which were reduced following this work to develop the territory represented 70% of the effort. So you're right, these are tools which measure if there is being a transition or not, and these are important. And when the EU wants to demonstrate greener projects, this also can be used to demonstrate carbon reduction projects. You, Mr. Lucianaz, you are the star. So here, the strategy for the Alpine region in terms of what you consider in terms of consultation between France and Italy, in concrete terms, in the field, is there an absence of a culture of change within the populations? Yes, it's a huge subject. In terms of a culture of change, we are working to set up a museum of the future, which should be a center to enable people to learn about everything that they do in the urban area. Often there are projects, there are studies which subsequently are not sufficiently well explained and shared with people. So we have approached this subject and we imagined this museum of the future. I can't wait to visit it. I can't wait to visit it. Where is it exactly? It's in my commune. In other words, the commune of Allier, where in Italy I am a mayor. In French, I've been mayor for 12 years. We have this project, an ambitious project. It's not easy to explain what we can put in a museum of the future. What we want to do, as I was saying, was to explain to people what we can expect in the future. We lived through the pandemic, the crisis, the war. Now we need to prepare people because they need to understand what the future will bring. So thank you for our guests for preparing the future and representing the enthusiasm for these cross-border projects, these border projects. Thank you to all of you for taking part in this roundtable. Let's applaud them. So to illustrate this project, Dryland, to show how much we can act across borders, to show that this question of resources, networks, for mobility, for energy, that we will speak about in the next roundtable are important. So now take a look at this video which presents this dry land project. Thank you once again.
trois villes de Bâle, Vallamrhein et Huningue
The three cities of Basel, this converge on a port which sits in this area and will change strongly in coming years. This large parcel will be freed up from their current uses to be used for new purposes.
Extrem wichtig für die Region, wo eben ein Lebensraum ist.
Rheinland ist für uns eine Chance.
This is a chance for us. This is just a very, very important project.
ont reconnu le fait qu'une planification commune permet les
recognize that planning together could demonstrate synergies sustainably and innovative across these three areas. The cities are moving close together, but whereas beforehand we spoke about the border, but the three regions develop together. There are leisure areas, cultural areas, open spaces, green spaces, which will be expanded and networked, and this project will allow an access to the Rhine for the general public. Mobility is at the heart of the dry land, the three countries, because if everybody stops at their borders, there is no continuity, and that is no longer acceptable. So working together on mobility, ensuring that the work each of us is doing on our various sides must be pursued opposite and be consistent, not just between the both sides of the Rhine, but between the three sides of the Rhine for the Highland project, because this is essential Trinational planning for mobility is a key element for the next part of the project. The bridge across the three countries, a cycle track built in 2007, brought the Val am Rijn and Huninge towns closer together. So there will be a bridge for cyclists and pedestrians and public transport, a bridge for cyclists and pedestrians between Val am Rijn and Basel, as well as a cycle track above the Rhine in Bâle. With these new infrastructures, the links between the three countries will be optimized.
Voilà.